So this is a talk which is based on an argument in this forthcoming book, but it's also a standalone paper. And it's actually something I have been probably thinking about too long. The first time I gave this talk was several years ago, and I kept following the politics of the left over these years, and so I'm hoping to kind of conclude it now. So I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. So let me just give the background to the talk. And the talk is really trying to understand the political strategy of the most important communist party in India, the Communist Party of India, Marxist, the CPIM. And the period in which I'm looking at this is from 1989. For those of you who follow Indian politics, you'd be very familiar with this. This is the year in which saw the demise of single-party majority governments in New Delhi. So since then, India has only had minority governments. Most of them have been coalitions, and they're the largest coalitions in the world, ranging from 7 to 23 parties in some cases. And there are three features of this period that are very important as far as political scientists are concerned about party dynamics. It's what's called the post-Congress polity, excuse me, and there are sort of three features of it. One is what's called the second democratic upsurge. This is the rising electoral participation of historically subordinate groups to the extent that they actually vote in greater numbers than more privileged groups. It's sort of an inverse of this, what usually happens in most democracies. The second is that the states of the Indian Union have become the primary arena of political competition. Right? So what happens in New Delhi is an aggregation of state-level verdicts. And the third is that the competition between parties in each state differs across the union. Right? So you don't have the same parties which are the most important organizations in each state. And as a result, you have what is called, this is a phrase by Eshwaran Sridharan, multiple bipolarities. You have different patterns of competition across the states. There's very high levels of electoral volatility. Incumbency is liability in India. And so you have parliamentary fragmentation in New Delhi. And as a result of this, there was a possibility many people foresaw in the late 1980s that you'd have a broader Indian left come together, what was called a third force. So I just show this map. Of course, most of you will be familiar with it, but just to show you in a sense that these different states of India have, in a sense, their own party systems. And they aggregate, almost in an artificial sense, in New Delhi in terms of national politics. I'm just going to show you a couple of slides to give you a sense of how many parties are contesting. You can't quite see the numbers here. This is 1952. This is 2004. If we updated this slide, in fact, it would be completely off the charts. The number of parties contesting elections was close to 250 in 2004 and is now much higher. Now, of course, many of those parties are not parties in a strong organizational sense. They're, in fact, cabals of one or two politicians. But even if we were to block out this top bar and just simply look at these two, which are national parties and state parties, that number is still close to 50. 50 parties, which are really competing for office, and many of them have a place in parliament. This is simply another chart showing you again the number of parties over time. It's sort of self-explanatory. And I guess the thing to note is if we put every other democracy in the world on this chart, they'd be roughly around here, in one of these sort of 2 or 3 bands, but nowhere quite close to India. So as a result, you've had these number of national governments, and I've listed them for you just to give you a sense. There are different ones. Some of them are center-right, led by the Hindu nationalist BJP. Some have been center-left by the Socialist Janata Dal, and some of them have been centrist by the Congress. The ones that I've underlined are the ones I'm going to focus on in particular today, because these are the ones in which the CPIM has had an incredibly important role to play. The National Front Government, 1989 to 91, the United Front Government, 1996 to 1998, and the United Progressive Alliance, which is still in power, led by the Congress, 2004 to 2009. Now, what have been the politics of the CPM? So, historically, you'll see from the phrasing here, a lot of this is taken directly from sort of, it's using the categories of Marxist political analysis itself, because this is what the CPIM itself uses to describe its strategies and explain its politics. Right. 3 strategies that the party has used. One is anti-capitalism, A second is anti-imperialism. And the third is what they call a people's democracy. And this, in a sense, explains why the party opposes certain parties versus others at different points in its history, why it chooses certain alliances versus others in its history. And I'm going to explain this as I go through the talk, but I just want to highlight them here. And as far as the CPIM or Marxists generally are concerned, tactics are really about the alliances between parties. So there have been two historically since independence in India. One is what are called united fronts, in which the CPIM and other left parties build alliances with non-left parties who they think they can influence. And the second are left fronts, which are, you have to in a sense espouse a faith or an ideology of communism or Marxism to belong in those fronts. And there have been a number of milestones. I'm just going to go through these very quickly. 1951, the new tactical line of the CPI, which decided to contest parliamentary elections. Before that, for 3 years, they had mounted an insurgency in India, in Telangana. 1957, the first communist elected government in any democracy in the world came to power in Kerala. 1964, I've been mentioning the CPIM, but actually, before 1964, there was a single major communist party of India. It was called the CPI. But divisions in that party, which I'm going to explain what the significance of those, led to a split in the party. So the CPIM that I'm particularly focused on really came into being in 1964. 1967, the party, along with others, pursued a strategy, or a set of tactics, of united fronts, most of which failed. 1975, India declared an emergency. The CPI, the parent party, actually supported the emergency. It's very important to know. It supported Indira Gandhi's suspension of democratic rule. And suffered hugely as a result of that. And 1977 is the beginning of the sort of the contemporary period in some sense, where you see a lot of left front governments, and particularly in 3 states, West Bengal, Kerala, and Tripura, where they have had relatively radical measures in agriculture, in particular in the countryside, which has led to a series of achievements. The sort of 2 highlights to think about. One is in Kerala, despite very low levels of industrialization, very high levels of literacy and life expectancy, leading to what's been called the Kerala model of development. And the second in West Bengal, declining income poverty and greater rights for sharecroppers in the countryside, as well as local village government, and led to a regime which was quite unparalleled in the world. The left front government led by the CPIM in West Bengal was in power from 1977 to 2011. And it's in that defeat in 2011 that it bookends this analysis I'm trying to do. So what's the puzzle? I've given you all this background. The puzzle is basically this, that the CPIM, since 1989, has backed a set of coalition governments in New Delhi. It's played a very important role in each of them. It's provided the crucial parliamentary support so that they can stay in office. It has been a broker in bringing these coalitions together, and it's often actually written or designed the agenda of these governments in office, which are called common minimum programs. But it's never accepted government participation. Right? It's been offered cabinet positions. In fact, most famously, and I'm going to talk about this in particular, in 1996 it was offered the prime ministership of the country, and it rejected it. Now, this is very unusual for any party, certainly in India, where most parties are happy to join power, happy to take office for the spoils of power, or because they think they can influence policymaking. It's also the case that fragmented executives allow small parties to have disproportionate power relative to their size. But the CPIM has steadfastly refused the offer of office, even the prime ministership, right? And that's quite extraordinary. You see it in European democracies, particularly Northern Europe and Scandinavia, but their institutional features are quite different. And in fact, most theorists would suspect that what's happening in India with the CPIM is quite unusual, given that its political institutions are quite different. So this is the puzzle. Why is it that the CPIM always has refused to take office in governments that it backs? Right? So there have been 3 general explanations. The first, and this is very much an explanation given by the party itself and its proponents, is that the CPIM makes these decisions because of its political principles, right? It sees itself as a vanguard of the most dispossessed classes. And this is a quote by Prakash Karat, the present General Secretary of the CPIM. But you could find many like this in the literature. As he says, the CPIM is the only party which can rally all the left, democratic, and progressive forces to carry forward the struggle for a left and democratic alternative. It sees itself as the main custodian, the main representative of the interests of the poorest and most disadvantaged citizens of the country, by definition. So a phrase you'll often hear is, the party embodies the interests of the working class. Second feature is the CPIM says, look, politics is not just about winning elections and gaining office. It's about struggles, right? So this quote is a good example of that. And so we're not going to take office just for the sake of it. We'll only take office if we think we can actually influence what's happening. Now, the second explanation for why they don't take office is almost diametrically opposed in some sense, and that's the politics of de-radicalization. That after coming to power in the states of West Bengal and Kerala, particularly since the late 1970s, both parties, according to a number of observers who are actually quite sympathetic to them, say you've seen a process of de-radicalization. These communist parties essentially have become social democratic parties. They've made peace with capitalist democracy. So they're more progressive than many other parties. They push through all kinds of measures in agriculture and industry which have been beneficial to workers and the peasantry. But on the whole, they're not radical anymore. And as a result of that, they're more interested in maintaining power for its own sake as well in these states. Right? The party itself gives a number of reasons why this might be the case, why they had to do this. It was severely repressed by the Indian state in the 1960s and 70s. It also had to, of course, win votes in elections. It had to build a broader base. And because of India's federal system, New Delhi could often be quite punitive or discriminatory versus these states in the allocation of licenses, in the implementation of president's rule, and so on. But whatever the set of reasons, most observers say that all these parties have de-radicalized. A second argument in this sort of general view is more critical, and it's often made, of course, not by proponents of the party or well-wishers, but their detractors, their rivals, which is that, well, look, the CPIM is just being hypocritical, right? It opposes something in New Delhi that it pursues in the states, and particularly on the question of liberalization. Since 1991, both parties, particularly in West Bengal, both regimes, particularly in West Bengal, have been pursuing liberal economic reforms, which they are blocking in New Delhi. And so this leads to this charge that the party is being hypocritical, it's exercising power without bearing responsibility. And so this is, again, you find many quotes like this. This was an interview I did in 1998. Tells you how long I've been studying this. The CPM wants to have their cake and eat it as well. They want the credit of opposing the BJP, the militant Hindu nationalists, without the responsibility. Third explanation. And none of these are mutually exclusive. They sort of, you can, and as you'll see, the explanation I'm going to give takes pieces from each of them. The third explanation, this is a phrase by Adam Jaworski, a very eminent political scientist looking at communist parties in Europe in the 20th century. And he says, why is it that in Europe in the 20th century so many communist parties essentially became social democratic parties or lost to social democratic parties? And he says, well, what they did was entirely rational. Right? So this is the phrase, rational choice Marxism. And there are two strands to this. That it makes sense for the CPIM not to join these coalition governments in New Delhi for two reasons. The first is that the parties which often hold power in New Delhi or are crucial to these governments are the rivals of the CPIM in the states. The Congress, particularly in the states of West Bengal and Kerala, it's its main rival, or has been until recently. It's still the case in Kerala, but it was in West Bengal until about 2007, 2008. And the BJP is a mortal enemy of the CPIM. Right? The CPIM has been the most steadfast opponent of militant Hindu nationalism in the country as far as parties are concerned. So it makes sense for the party to keep a distance from these parties and not share power with them. I mean, it's never wanted to share power with the BJP, but even the Congress, it needs to keep a distance from the Congress. And so it takes the stance where it'll support a Congress-backed government or a government backed by other, as it says, bourgeois parties, which it even calls the socialists now, or the regional parties. And so for that reason, that's what they do. The second aspect of it is the dynamics of liberalization in India. After India began to liberalize in the early 1990s, it was quite a latecomer to this compared to Latin America and Africa, but once it began to liberalize, it forced the states of the Indian federal system to compete with each other, with each other for scarce private investment. Public investment declined from New Delhi, central transfers declined, and as a result, you saw many state governments, regardless of whoever was running them, forced to compete in the domestic and international marketplace for scarce private capital. And this basically led to all kinds of tensions within parties, within coalitions, and forced many of them to adopt a two-level game. This is very much the insight of Rob Jenkins, another political scientist, where he says they could oppose policies in New Delhi, national opposition, but they had to accommodate them in the states. And this quote by a member of the Politburo sort of sums up this kind of reasoning too, where he says, our decision not to join these governments was based on a judgment, to participate only if we can influence policy. We were not in a position to do so, because there were never a majority in any of these cabinets. We didn't have sufficient numbers, we didn't have sufficient strength. Rapid reforms hurt the common man, and we would take the blame for policies we actually opposed. So this is an argument saying, look, if we are pursuing liberalization in West Bengal, and to a lesser extent in Kerala, we don't want to do it. We have no choice. These are the compulsions of contesting for power in a capitalist democracy with federal institutions. And of course, there's a lot of value in that view. But the argument that I'm going to try to present takes bits and pieces of all of these, but looks at something I think which sort of lies under them, which is really the theory of politics that really influences particularly the ideologues in the CPIM. And so the argument I want to make is that its theory or its conception of politics, which leads to these decisions that the CPM takes not to join these governments that it backs. And this is probably the more controversial bit of the argument, certainly the more debatable version or aspect of it, which is that I think this theory or conception of politics that the party has is actually inimical to good political judgment. It has three features. One is it has a very moralistic conception of political responsibility, focusing on intentions rather than the consequences of action. The second is that it has a conception of power, or it entails a conception of power, which is absolute, right? The party often wants to monopolize power completely. It shares power amongst itself, i.e. with other communist-related parties, but it's very reluctant to share formal power, particularly since 1989, with any non-communist parties. And certainly in the case of West Bengal, which has been the bastion of the CPIM, you also see, as many analysts have observed, a colonization of space in civil society and the public sphere, whether it's universities, schools, unions, and so on. So it's an absolute conception of power that militates against power sharing. The third is the notion of possibility. How do we decide what's possible in politics, right? And here I think the CPIM exhibits a structural determinist notion of possibility, right? This notion that in order to determine what's possible in politics, we have to think about the structures of politics, and they have a deterministic quality. And in fact, we can even see laws that determine how we should behave, right? So the first quote, sort of fairly prosaic quote, if we have strength like we do in West Bengal, and then we display responsibility. This is a chart saying, well, when you exercise power without holding office, you're being irresponsible. And so the response by many Politburo members is, no, we display responsibility if we have a majority in office, right? It's kind of, you might say it's sort of splitting hairs. The second quote is one from Mao Zedong, but you could find probably similar ones. I just particularly like this one because it's so clearly stated. But it's a basic Leninist idea. This idea of strategy and tactics as being governed by laws, right? The task of a science of strategy for politics is to study those laws, this is my italics, for directing a war that governs a war situation as a whole. The task of the science of tactics is to study those laws for directing the war that governs a particular situation, right? This is an idea of strategy and tactics that's very determined by universal theoretical principles, laws. And as a result, I think this is the last line there is actually, as I've understood it, an old Soviet joke. But I think captures this idea, right? The future is certain, it's only the past that's unpredictable, right? And this is sort of an idea that gets to the heart, especially when you interview lots of CPIM politicians, as I've done. The future is always, you always know what's going to happen. Capitalism is going to end, right? But there's a lot of dispute about revisiting what actually happened in the past. And I think this is just a reflection, although it's a joke, it's a reflection of this general theoretical paradigm that informs the ways in which many of the more ideological hardliners in the party think about politics. So I'm going to take you through now these three critical moments to show why I think this way of thinking about the politics of the CPM is more persuasive than the others. And again, like I said, I'm borrowing from them, but trying to make a slightly different point. So the first was the National Front government. This was a coalition that came to power in 1989. It came to power to unseat the Congress. It was led by VP Singh, who was a former congressman, but who mobilized a broad popular support on the plank of anti-corruption against Rajiv Gandhi's regime. He was a minister in that. He uncovered a lot of corruption, the famous Bofors scandal, amongst others. And he created a groundswell to bring this coalition of parties to power. He was a leader of the Janata Dal, the Socialist Party of India. It's had many splits and mergers over its years, and he brought it together in the late 1980s. And he brought together a number of other parties with him, a set of regional parties, the DMK, TDP, and AGP. But it was still a minority coalition. So in order to have power in parliament, he had to have external support. And he relied on the two mortal enemies, the two parties that were mortal enemies of each other, the BJP on the one hand, and the Left Front on the other, right? And the main issues at stake in this period, in fact, this is probably the most critical 2 years of contemporary Indian politics, 1989 to 1991, was arguments over the position of intermediate and lower castes in public life, which led to the so-called Mandal Commission report, which this government introduced, giving reservations to other backward classes in higher public institutions and national life. Mandir, the threat of militant Hindu nationalism. The BJP had been campaigning for building a Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, the site of the Babri Masjid, and eventually led to its destruction in 1992. And market, right? This was growing pressures in India to begin to liberalize its economy. It had a major fiscal and balance of payments crisis in the late 1980s, which is what led to the beginnings of economic liberalization in India under the Congress regime that came after this government. So these were the sets of issues. And the CPM could have joined this government. It decided to support it from the outside on sort of two main grounds, right? One was, it was extremely critical of the fact that VP Singh and the Janata Dal were taking the support of the BJP, the Hindu nationalists, which were threatening secularism in India at the time. And not only that, it had seat adjustments with these parties in a lot of states in northern India, right? So it contested for office as an alliance in many cases. There were tensions between the Janata Dal and the BJP. In fact, they broke into the open during this government. But the fact that they even countenanced these alliances for the CPM was a non-starter. So it was very reluctant to join a government that had any association with the BJP. The second was that VP Singh in particular was called unprincipled. I put it in quotation marks because this is to get at the sort of the language of morality which infuses a lot of the party's justifications. He was unprincipled, one, because of course he even took the support of the BJP, but second, because the CPIM said, well, he was actually the finance minister in the previous Congress government and he had begun to liberalize the economy himself. So we couldn't trust him to be an opponent of economic structural reforms. And as it happened during this government, There was a lot of internal turmoil within the Janta Dal over leadership issues, which has been a historic problem for the party. But also the main conflict came between the Janta Dal and the BJP over the Mandal Commission report, this report that I mentioned, which VP Singh implemented in August 1990, which granted 27% reservations for other backward classes. And that was a direct threat to the social base of the BJP, which was largely high caste urban elites in northern India. And the BJP immediately withdrew within 2 months, withdrew support to the government, which caused it to fall. So that first government that the CPIM didn't take part in, it seems like a very rational and in fact wise decision not to join that government. Right? There are all kinds of reasons not to join that government. And it did sort of the right thing and the smart thing, you could say. But after the government fell, it was still quite striking that in the campaign for the next election, which took place in 1991, Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated by the LTTE in May, just weeks before the polls were to open. And the CPIM did something quite extraordinary. The leader of the party at the time, EMS Namboodiripad, a very famous leader of the party in Kerala, chief minister there, in 1957, this famous first Communist Party government, issued an open letter to the Congress Party, asking the party to reconsider its stance towards the CPIM. Now, most observers read that as the opposite. It was basically declaring that the CPIM might consider supporting a Congress national emergency government in this situation. Right? So this was the first inkling that there were tensions in the party about whether to support and join governments or not. And of course, this has a long back history as well. I can talk about that and question and answer. But in this period that I'm looking at, this is the first moment you see the CPIM, which has often been the party that has been most consistently opposed to supporting bourgeois parties of any kind, saying, we're going to consider this. The second moment that really matters in this story is the United Front government. This is what's called the crystallization of the third force. This is the first government we see in India which is directly opposed to the Congress and the BJP. Right? What's distinctive about it is it has three dimensions, this coalition. It has the old socialist bloc, the Janta Dal and the Samajwadi Party. It has a group of regional parties which really become important in India in the 1990s. They grow in stature and clout. What's called the Federal Front in this period. And then, of course, you have something which is quite extraordinary, is that the CPI, right, the other major party of the left front, actually joins the government. The Home Minister of the United Front government, Indrajit Gupta, the Agricultural Minister of the government, Jatiranand Mishra, are both members of the CPI, right? They actually join the government and take actually two very powerful positions in that government, the Home Ministry in particular, right? One of the three most important ministries in any parliamentary regime. And it's in this period, in these crucial weeks, that when the government is formed, that Jyoti Basu, who is at that point the chief minister of the CPIM in West Bengal, is offered the prime ministership of the country, right? To keep the BJP and the threat of militant Hindu nationalism at bay. And he and some others in the Politburo and the Central Committee of the party accept it. But the majority of the Central Committee takes a vote and rejects this offer, right? It denies him this possibility. And one of the main editorials at the time, says that this decision was a virtuous one. It was a virtue of abstinence, right? There were sort of two basic reasons why the CPIM shouldn't join the government here. One is that it was an unholy alliance. It relied on the Congress. The Congress party, even though the government came to power against the Congress was the single largest outside supporter to that government. It had about 140 seats in parliament. This was another minority coalition. So it's an unholy alliance. The Congress couldn't be trusted to allow the government to last a full 5 years. We shouldn't get involved with this situation. The second, and the language here is quite revealing, is that a number of these regional parties, and even some of the socialists in the government, were pursuing liberalization in the states, right? As, of course, was the CPIM in West Bengal, as I'll explain in a moment. But as a result, a number of members of the Politburo said, we knew that the government, the United Front, would pursue certain policies and actions representing landlords and kulaks. This we couldn't support because then we'd be responsible. Again, this sort of theme about under what conditions do you bear political responsibility, right? So it's on that decision that they rejected the prime ministership and any other government office. Now the record, of course, was quite mixed. This was another short-lived government. It only lasted 2 years in office. The Congress did what the CPIM expected. In fact, most parties expected. It pulled the rug on the government on very flimsy grounds in 1998. A flawed interim report into the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, which implicated one of its members, the DMK, falsely. But what was interesting about this period is that the United Front government both advanced liberalization as the CPIM feared. The CPIM, as a member of the coalition steering committee, also blocked a number of measures: privatization, reducing the fiscal deficit, liberalizing agriculture and labor laws. But what's interesting is that at the same time, in West Bengal, it began to liberalize quite rapidly, right? It had a new industrial policy in 1995, which basically looked very similar to the industrial policies of many other states in the center, which was trying to compete for foreign investment. Jyoti Basu was looking for foreign investment, going to Davos, seeking foreign capital, precisely because of these new dynamics of the federal political system. And he, in particular, this is sort of, I suppose, the most dramatic moment in this story, even if I haven't sort of conveyed the drama, right? But it's that in January 1997, in the middle of this government, he had an interview with a journalist in the Asian Age, where he basically said this decision not to join the government was a historic blunder, right? Terrible mistake. And this is why he said it, right? He's now recounting the debates in the Central Committee at the time. He said, we in the center, we said the center, the prime minister, wields a lot of influence. And you see that we, as you can read the quote, you see the World Bank is there, the IMF is there. They're blindly accepting, they meaning the other parties, all that advice given to them, which we shall not do. The people will have a new experience. Within these limitations, the limitations of working in a capitalist democratic system, so many things could have been done. Then if we're thrown out, people will understand with whom lies the responsibility. So all these debates about how do we think about political responsibility. He then goes on to say, our argument was this can't last 5 years. If we're there much more than the others, we can make them accept some policies. He's reiterating this idea. You can't remove every obstacle. That's not possible. But you can do something for self-reliance, for the countryside, from panchayats, village self-government. All that we can push through. Anti-poverty programs. It's there, but it's not reaching the people. But it's a political blunder. It's a historic blunder. And this caused incredible consternation in the party when this interview was published. And then he goes on later to say, this is this idea of possibility. How do we think about possibility in politics? In politics, there are moments when you have to rise to the occasion. To the needs of the hour and the pleas of the people are infallible judge. Now, you might think of this as just sort of cant. But it sort of gets at this idea that there are certain moments or windows of opportunity. And Jyoti Basu is trying to express a certain way of thinking about political responsibility and possibility and the conditions of power. But the government fails, and that offer is never given again. It then takes until 2004 for the last moment where the CPIM is invited to join a government. This time, it's a Congress-led government. The Congress had been out of power for a long political winter since 1996 because it basically refused to enter any coalitions with any other parties. It sort of kept up the dream that it could come to power on its own. You still see very strong residues of this in the Congress if you follow it in the press in India. But it finally realized after being almost a decade out of power in New Delhi, that it had to submit to the logic of this new party system, which is that you could only come to power if you built multi-party coalitions. So it finally did. The party was the largest in this coalition, the Congress, but it crucially needed, again, it needed votes in the Lok Sabha, in Parliament, to gain a majority. It had roughly 216 votes. And you needed 272 to form a majority government. The left front parties in this election recorded their highest electoral victory since independence. 61 or 62 seats in the Lok Sabha. They'd never had such a high percentage of the seats in Parliament. And it was a really critical election because this was an election that came after 2 successive governments led by the BJP, in which the entire polity had really shifted to the right, in many cases. And of course, the BJP, although restrained by coalition politics, was not completely restrained. And in 2002, in the state of Gujarat, you had an anti-Muslim pogrom in the town of Godhra, which cost thousands of lives. It's still, the fallout of that is still being played out in Indian politics today. So that incident and the BJP's threat to secularism was a major issue for the parties. Rising inequality in India, which had been increasingly visible in these years, became a second issue, led the Congress to proclaim that it was fighting for the Aam Admi, the common man, in this election. And also relations with Pakistan were a crucial issue in this period, because it was in the early 2001, 2002, that both countries were on the brink of a nuclear exchange. 1999, the war in Kargil, and afterwards the attack on the Indian parliament led to incredibly severe hostilities between both countries, and also attempts to start a peace process. And it was because of these sort of conditions, these circumstances, that it was quite interesting. It was at this moment again that a group of intellectuals, activists, party workers issued an open letter to both the CPI and the CPM, saying, as I will read it now, "At this historic juncture, which calls for creative and constructive initiative, the left can undertake the task only as part of the government and not by supporting it from outside. The latter is the negative approach, which the people are likely to interpret as shirking the responsibility. To usher in changes on secular and democratic lines, the left has to use the possible access to power, even if there are certain political risks. After all, the quality of life of the people in West Bengal and Kerala would not have been possible without the left wielding power." So this was an open appeal to the general secretaries of these 2 parties, Harkishan Surjit and A.B. Bardhan. The CPIM again had to take a vote in the Central Committee of the party, and it defeated the resolution that it should join the government. And the justification, I'm giving here a quote from the new General Secretary who takes over the party, Prakash Karat, in 2005, where he says, "To advance the struggle against communalism, Hindu nationalism, the pro-big business economic policies, and imperialism, the party has extended support to the UPA government with the clear understanding that it depends on the willingness to implement the pro-people measures of the CMP, the Common Minimum Program, which the party helped to design. To accomplish this, the party will build mass movements and conduct struggles. It should act as a sentinel of the people's interests, which will work to build a third alternative by conducting joint movements and campaigns. Experience has shown that this cannot just be an electoral alliance." Now, that was very crucial. That last line was very important for those following the party, because what it said was it wasn't going to cobble together a third front of parties to gain power like it tried to do in 1996, right? It was taking, in a sense, the hard ideological line on how to pursue power. And what happened during this government? Well, pretty early on, it was quite interesting. There were lots of contentious battles between the CPIM and the Congress over liberalization. You saw a whole raft of new measures in India, which are actually quite important, on new social rights, which the CPIM, although it takes probably too much credit for them, actually played a very important role in bringing about. The right to information, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the Forest Rights Act, the right to education. These are all bills which have granted new social entitlements in India, and the left did play a very important role in pushing them with like-minded colleagues in the Congress, most importantly Sonia Gandhi, who set up the National Advisory Council, which became sort of the sort of think tank of the new government on progressive social policy. The left also opposed further liberalization in many sectors of the economy, which the Congress was very adamant to push through. The privatization of state-owned enterprises, the liberalization of insurance, greater foreign direct investment in infrastructure. The left kept stopping or scaling back a lot of these initiatives, right? So it was behaving in the way in which it wanted to. But at the same time, in West Bengal, what you saw happening was exactly the kinds of policies that it was opposing in New Delhi, right? You had a lot of dispossession of land by the state government, this time led by a new chief minister, Buddhadev Bhattacharya, and what Marxists would call primitive accumulation, accumulation by dispossession, right? And this created a lot of conflict in the countryside amongst the peasantry, who were, of course, those voters who were keeping the CPIM in power for these decades. And it led to very severe conflicts, the ones that were most famously reported on in Nandigram and Shingur, where you had pitched battles, an outbreak of violence between the CPIM, the peasantry, Maoist forces which had broken away from the party in the late 1960s, and an opposition party led by a former Congress party worker, the Trinamool Congress as well, right? So you have in West Bengal conflicts over the policies that the CPIM is opposing in New Delhi but pushing through quite radically in West Bengal. You also have stagnation in the social sector, a decline in social sector spending, very middling outcomes on all kinds of health and educational indicators in the state. And you have, as you might expect after 3 decades of a party being in power, right, the sense that there's no space in West Bengal for dissent outside of the party, right? I mean, it's not a totalitarian situation in any sense, but many, again, figures described it as a partocracy, right? A situation where the party has really infiltrated and colonized a lot of the state and many spaces in society, and done it in a way which has really suppressed democratic politics. And a crucial moment happens. I realize I'm running out of time, so I'm almost finished here. The crucial moment happens in 2008. When, during these years, when all this is happening, from 2004 to 2008, the Congress Party in the coalition at the center is pursuing greater strategic ties with the United States. It was an initiative that had really begun with the previous government led by the Hindu nationalists, but it was under the Congress that it came to light that the United States was willing to grant India the status of a nuclear power, even though it hadn't joined the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. In fact, when India had tested its nuclear devices in the late 1980s under the BJP government at the time, there were massive sanctions imposed on India by the United States and other countries. But the US had decided in these years, particularly after George Bush had come to power, that it wanted India to be a strategic ally of the United States vis-a-vis China. And so there were all these meetings that were taking place at the time, and the Congress carried them through. The CPIM explicitly stated, when it supported the government in 2004 and drafted this common minimum program, that there should be no attempts to pursue this relationship, right? And the Congress ignored them. It just went ahead and did this. So there was a new defense strategic framework agreement in 2005 that was unveiled, and what was called the Indo-US Civil Nuclear Deal, where the United States would recognize India as a nuclear power, granted access to fissile materials and fuel supplies in exchange, and this is where the communists became very suspicious and hostile, in exchange for what? For India to begin to cooperate with the United States as an ally in a whole series of strategic issues, whether it had to do with Iran, whether it had to do with China, and so on. And this led to an incredible showdown in national politics in the year 2008, which led to a famous trust vote, in which the CPIM said, if you go ahead with this plan, which is against the interests of India, which is going to compromise its foreign policy autonomy and its strategic autonomy, we're going to pull the government down, right? They issued a threat which they carried out. And the government itself survived because it was able to get enough support from other opposition parties, partly because some members of those parties actually broke ranks. They thought it was a good deal, partly because of immense, what seems a specter of corruption, right? On the day of the trust vote, huge bags of money were shown in the floor of the Lok Sabha, 1 crore rupees, right? So it was an incredibly sordid event. It robbed the Congress of any moral authority, whatever you thought of the deal. But the CPIM decided that this was basically an imperial strategic document. The party, of course, its main strategy, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, was anti-imperialism was one of its two main strategic positions. It couldn't countenance this on its watch, so it tried to bring the government down, and it failed. And then despite what Prakash Karat said, that they would not pursue another electoral alliance of a third force type, that's exactly what they tried to do. Right? They hadn't been doing these campaigns with parties in these years, but they wanted to unseat the Congress. And so they tried to build a third force. And the results were a disaster for the party. It fell from its highest presence in the Lok Sabha in 2004, roughly 60 odd plus seats, to just 24 in the 2009 elections. The CPIM had been reduced to 16 seats, its lowest tally probably since the 1960s. It's completely decimated. And then in the West Bengal polls, 2011, it was removed from office for the first time since 1977, right? On the grounds of the kinds of policies I just mentioned, that it was pursuing economic liberalization in the states, which it was opposing at the center. And so this is a long quote, but I just give it to you to kind of highlight why I focus on this question of judgment, right? These key words that keep popping up in these quotes: responsibility, power, judgment. So this is Manmohan Singh speaking on the day of the vote of confidence, which potentially brought down the government. So incredibly long, fractious proceedings, about 8 hours long. He gave a speech in the middle of it. And he says, the leader of the opposition, the BJP, Shri Lal Krishna Advani, has chosen to use all manner of abusive adjectives to describe my performance. He's saying this because Advani himself was such an important proponent of building stronger ties with the United States. Right? It's a long-standing goal of the Hindu nationalists. He has described me as the weakest prime minister, a nikama PM, and having devalued the office of the prime minister. To fulfill his ambitions, he's made at least 3 attempts to topple our government, but on each occasion his astrologers have misled him. At his ripe old age, I don't expect Shri Advani to change his thinking, but for his sake and India's sake, I urge him to at least change his astrologers so that he gets more accurate predictions of things to come. Right? Now, I'm not trying to valorize Manmohan Singh. He himself has made lots of terrible political misjudgments in his own prime ministership, but that in itself just reinforces the importance of judgment in these kinds of politics, when power is so dispersed and so fractious, and predictions are so difficult. He then goes on to say, our friends in the left front should ponder over the company they are forced to keep, because it was in this vote that the left front voted with the BJP. These two mortal enemies had to take the same side, right? Something that you couldn't quite imagine even 5 years before that, because of the miscalculations of their general secretary, Prakash Karat, who was really adamant that you had to vote against the government. And again, there was dissension within the party. Jyoti Basu reportedly said, we shouldn't bring the government down on this because it's not going to help the party, even if we're opposed to it. You know? Others said we should have brought down the government, but we should have done it a year ago when it was trying to push through liberalization and privatization in New Delhi. But we didn't do it. We got the timing wrong. So again, all these debates happening in the party about whether it was a good decision and whether, if it was a good decision, whether it was done at the right time. Right? The essence of timing in good political judgment. So the party, as I said, what's happened in these years is it has increasingly found itself stranded between government and opposition. It's increasingly found itself in a contradictory position. And I've tried to explain why that's the case. Right? Looking at the dynamics of the Indian political system, the effects of liberalization, they're all important. But I think what has not gotten as much emphasis, at least in scholarly debates so far, is the conception of politics and the type of judgments that the party has made at crucial moments, which is what I've been trying to emphasize in this talk. So I've come away with sort of 3 conclusions. One is that what the CPIM did was completely rational. Right? Rational choice theorists in the social sciences would say, well, they just did what you would expect them to do. Right? And I think that's true. But the conception of power and the theory of strategy and tactics that the party employs, in a funny way, disregards and frustrates the needs for good political judgment. And I've never actually explained what I mean by that. I should have done that at the beginning. but good political judgment in the sense that realists often talk about it, which is that to understand what's possible to do in a given set of circumstances, which focuses on particulars, on what is practical within a given context, as opposed to what is general or theoretical about your understanding of a situation. And even the General Secretary of the CPI, Aybi Barden, on the moment he's stepping down in 2002, in an interview again, revisits his tenure. He'd been the General Secretary for decades as well. And he basically is asked, 1996, when Jyoti Basu was offered the prime ministership, was he right? And he says, yes, he was. It was a historic blunder. The fact that India would have had a communist prime minister maybe for 1.5 or 2 years, that Obama phrase, yes, we can, it's a meaningful phrase. Now again, whatever you think of Obama, whatever you think of that phrase, that's not the reason I put the quote. I put the quote simply to say that this debate is still roiling the party, and it's now looking back upon that history. As one commentator, Arvind Das, put it, in quite stinging manner, he said that the fact that they lost that opportunity to become the prime minister and now want it is evidence that the passions of youth have become the lust of old men. Right? A very sort of stinging rebuke. But he's trying to get at that fact that, that's the point about good political judgment. It has to be historically situated. And you do not have these openings for long periods of time. So that's the first conclusion. The second is that it's ironic that the party has come to this situation. Because what the party was criticized for in the 1980s and 1990s by many Marxists, right, who are not part of the party, but were Marxists who wanted the party to carry through with its radical potential, was that they were obsessed with maintaining state power in West Bengal and Kerala at the expense of mobilizing new social groups on more radical agendas. So given that the party was so obsessed with maintaining state power, why did it forsake the opportunity to exercise national state power, right? So you really get a sense of a party that is riven with sort of conflict and dissension on this issue. And the third is, in a sense, the debates on where does the party go from here. And here there's a whole range of positions. One is that, well, the party should just realize what it is. It's a reformist social democratic party and it should embrace the path of reform. Others, such as Prabhat Patnaik, who's very close to the party, an eminent economist, says, well, that's a recipe for disaster. If it actually openly embraces reform, as opposed to saying that it's compelled to do for structural reasons, it's going to annihilate the party. Because it's a communist party. It's not a social democratic party. Right? What makes it distinctive is that it holds out the hope of overcoming capitalism. Right? If it goes back on that hope, then what makes it a communist party? Right? Another set of debates that you have today is whether the party, whether it takes a more radical path again, or it takes a more openly reformist position or not, whether we need a new communist party. This is a position by another famous eminent Marxist in India, Achint Vinayak. He says, we have to now, if we are Marxists, we have to just forget about the Communist Party of India. Right? It has become a vehicle which is just too beholden to its own self-interests. We need a new party, and we need a more radical path. So whatever position you take on these debates, it still underscores the importance of the ideology, which is both what makes the party distinctive, but it's also its burden, in a sense, right? That, in a sense, it is a social democratic party, but its faith in communism has trapped it in this position, as I've put it, as in between government and opposition. So I'm going to end on that.
Just one, because time is short, I'm just going to ask one short question, which is, the party is very much a cadre-based party, right? It's so the people who are down there and the sort of things are going to be very important in how the party is deciding. You haven't told us much about what's happening there. And in that context, there's one comment about sort of West Bengal and the sort of, the fact that you said the party sort of colonized all civil spaces and so on. In a sense, the story which is coming from the inside is the opposite, that knowing that the party has been there for so long, a whole bunch of, people who are lusting for power sort of join this, the local gundas, the whatever, and so on and so forth. So there's a story to be told there as well.
I agree. I mean, I probably simplify the situation when I say, it's not, I mean, probably more accurately to say is it's attempted to colonize a lot of space in civil society. And there are lots of analyses of this, of course, right? Analyses about what the party has done to university life, for instance, in Kolkata and other cities in West Bengal, about how the panchayats are run, who runs them. As you say, there's sort of a Gunda Raj, which is sort of, taken over. The party has benefited from that in some cases. As with any party that's been in power for a long time, right? It starts to attract all kinds of unprincipled elements, to use even the language of the left, right? We see this, of course, in West Bengal. You see factionalism of a similar type in Kerala, even though it's much more of a mobilizational-based party in Kerala, more progressive in many ways. So I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I oversimplify the situation in West Bengal. But I think, for instance, and this is a very controversial issue, and there are lots of sides on this debate, but, for instance, when violence erupted in Nandigram, right, over the question of land, now CPM quite rightly always defends itself, says no land was actually taken from the peasantry in this set of villages. A decision was taken to take their land, but no land was actually taken, unlike Shingur, where land actually had been taken away, and so you had a mobilization against it. The CPIM says that, look, the other parties, and also, right, the former brethren of the CPIM which left, the Naxalites, right, started to use violence against our own party workers. So we had to defend ourselves, right? And I haven't studied that, I haven't visited or done any work of that type in these areas. I just rely on other accounts I've read. And the account that you get is that all sides, of course, have been complicit in this violence, right? But what it at least does is puncture the view that the CPIM itself was simply the victim of, right, these other forces who were directly targeting them. So what was interesting about this is even members in the Politburo sort of confessed by the end of it that, we just assumed because we won the mandate in the previous state assembly election in 2006 that we had a mandate to carry this out. We had no consultations with those who supported us whether we could expropriate their lands. And it's in that sense that people who are critical of the party say, look, there's a vestige of this being a partocracy, right? That democratic centralism, right? The feature of the party that all decisions are collectively taken and binding, right? It's quite an astonishing aspect of the party that, the most important representative of the party in electoral politics, Jyoti Basu, being offered the prime ministership is denied it by the Central Committee, a group of 125 members of the party. You could say that's a great virtue of the party, right? But dissent within the party is not tolerated, right? Much. It's very quickly suppressed, precisely because they want to maintain a collective front. And you see many instances of this. The most recent was probably a year ago, where a member of the CPIM student wing in JNU, right, openly criticized the party and was expelled within 2 weeks, right? So it's that kind of feature of the party that I was trying to get at.
But what's the kind of thinking about this whole game at the center?
What's
about joining the government versus playing the outside role?
I tried to find out. That's the thing. Because of democratic centralism in the party, I would love to have seen when I was doing the research early on, like if they had a roll call vote in the Central Committee, who was for, who was against it. We have a good sense of some of the big figures who was against and for it. Jyoti Basu was for joining the governments in these instances. Harkishan Singh Surjit, who passed away recently, was also for it. He was a previous general secretary. Prakash Karat has always been adamantly opposed to it. You have to read the tea leaves a little bit. But I think what's happened is that, just simply the contradiction, the disjuncture between the Central Committee and the Politburo saying something in New Delhi and the party doing something in West Bengal. Right? If you're a cadre base, I haven't done that research, but from those who have and who I've read, there's incredible disaffection and disillusionment amongst many ranks of the cadre, right? What are we doing, right? And I think that's where this party in particular has a particular problem. Unlike, say, the PT, the Workers' Party in Brazil, which was never a communist party. It's a workers' party. So it can pursue all kinds of social democratic strategies openly. And there are fights within that party about whether they should be radical or reformist, but they're not, in a sense, encumbered by that ideology of communism, that you're going to overcome capitalism. And I think that's what creates the intensity of debate and difficulty of debate in the CPIM, right? That it is distinctive. It's not just that as long as it's called the Communist Party of India, Marxist, its debates are going to be particularly difficult on this question of, do we join governments, do we support them, should we be reformist, should we be radical? Sorry, there were a couple. Should I take a cluster?
Sure. Yeah, because we don't have that much time. So
okay,
yeah, go ahead.
back. And then.
Thank you very much. This is fascinating. I want to know, is there any direct support or contact between India's left and China and Russia?
Well, that was most of the analysis of the Communist Party in the early decades was solely about that. I can refer you to some of it. You know, a classic account is called Communism in India by Jean Overstreet. It's Overstreet and Windmiller, the authors. It's a 600-page tome which talks about the linkages between the Indian Communist Party and its beginnings and the Soviet Union.
Currently, is there?
I mean, I haven't studied that, but I'm sure there are. I mean, there are exchanges between all time. The CPIM has been the most vocal proponent of China in India, which is what has caused so much debate within the country, that how can you support China versus India, aren't you good nationalists, and so on. The CPI has been more critical of China. And so I haven't studied any of that myself, but there is a literature on that. Yeah.
The question that I have is first an observation, and it has to do with the fact that you're talking to not really distinguish between the nature of corruption at the state level and the nature of corruption at the national level. And I would suggest that if you look what happened in West Bengal, you see a level of corruption that begins to enter, as noted, by other people trying to get a piece of the pie. And on the national level, it's somewhat different because you're dealing with this broad neoliberalism. But the question that I have, and it's in defense of this concept of power and theory, strategy, and tactics, is that there is some, what you refer to as moral authority. I think there is a reason in which a party takes a stand on certain issues and as a result refuses to participate. And although your quote from Obama may not be meant to be ironic, I would suggest that it speaks volumes, and that the question for the left, who embraced Obama saying, yes, we can, is similar to what occurs in India when they say, well, let's join in, because unless we attempt to use power, then we'll get nowhere. I would suggest that if you look at that kind of alliances, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in Southeast Asia, the left always loses. It gets some minor crumbs off the table, but the problem is that the overall process of the World Bank, et cetera, not to suggest a conspiracy, I mean, they make their point very clearly, is that the left loses, and that to participate in that denies you the ability to create a new movement. And I think the problem that I saw with your presentation is that it doesn't take into account the co-optation that occurs as a result of corruption, actual corruption, in a federal system, at the state and at the government. So I think there's a real reason to have a conception of power, and I think there's a real Maoist reason to differentiate between strategies and tactics. And if you look historically, because as the quote that you gave us, it's the past that's unpredictable. If you look historically, I don't think you can identify left government's participation in government with success.
Should I take some more?
That's
important.
No, quickly.
Just a quick question. It's a very interesting talk, but it left me wondering if in your framework the question of political mobilization should not be more prominent, because it seems like a number of questions that have to do with the politics of possibility, the internal tensions between the Central Politburo and the cadre on the ground. Is also kind of a challenge to the way in which the CPM has traditionally operated its channels for political mobilization, which is primarily through cadre building, but in a time where there are very few people with sort of permanent jobs who can be mobilized. a labor aristocracy that was there, kind of their spine, that is now not going to be able to reproduce itself. And also the question of, I think more broadly the relationship between a cadre-based party and a more activist-based party in terms of the kinds of decisions that are feasible then, both at the the most local level and the central level. And the reason I ask is that in terms of the kind of cadre organization, it's often more compared with the RSS, which does not actually have a political party status in the sense it doesn't fight elections. Or, with the more left, the ML and the other elections.
Did you have
I was intrigued by the term, the need for good political judgment. Because in one state, like in Gujarat, Modi may be exercising good political judgment by fostering growth, but in another state that might not be good political judgment. So I'm wondering, is there a common denominator that either that you go back to the people, or is it something objective about good political judgment?
Yeah.
So I think it needs a little kind of a definition.
Yeah, no, of course. So those are three big questions. Let me try to answer them. I think they're sort of.
We'll land afterwards.
Yeah. Let me try to answer them. So, to the first question, I agree with you that many communist parties, when they've joined these governments, so you can think of Sri Lanka, you can think of Italy, and so on, when they join these coalition governments, they get moderated. Now, I think that's true, but it begs the question of what the alternative was. I think what happens in a lot of this discourse is saying, well, if we join, we're going to have to compromise, right? And that's absolutely true, especially in a place like India, where there are so many parties, so many interests, so many groups, so many parties that historically have been on the left, which the left themselves don't always recognize, right? The socialists from the 1930s, right? Through to the 1960s, at least in its heyday. That it sort of begs the question that, so who is the proper who is the representative of workers and peasants, right? The CPM itself just assumes it is the only one, right? It says this over and over again. You can read the most recent sort of literature on this. It'll say, well, these parties couldn't possibly replace us as a proper representative. And that sort of begs the question, well, why has the CPM been so trapped in 3 states? Why hasn't the CPM been able to expand its presence across northern India? It's never been able to tackle the question of caste in these states. It's striking. The most high caste parties in India today are the left. The ranks of the CPIM are the most high caste in the whole country, right? Now that means that they're very progressive on some issues and they're very conservative on others. And that just sort of raises the issue about, so there are many conflicts, there are many aspects to a sort of progressive social agenda. The left has been very active on some, but it's been completely poor on others. But it maintains this position that it is the proper custodian of this. So I think the sort of 2 aspects then, I guess, to the question, which is one, does it need to build broader coalitions, even social coalitions within its own party? It means absolutely true that it has to mobilize. But I think that's what also begs, why does it have so much difficulty mobilizing new groups to its ranks, right? That's a deeper question. You're right. But what's interesting is that the quote I gave, you could read 30 years of the Marxists, so the CPIM newsletter, and you'd have the same strategy. We must build alliances, we must mobilize. I mean, it's sort of a mantra. It's sort of, you keep saying it, and 30 years go by, and the ranks of the party have not expanded, right? So why is that the case? So I think that's a general sort of problem or dilemma for the party to face squarely, right? And so in a sense, I agree and I disagree. I agree that sharing power almost inevitably forces you to compromise, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the compromises are always going to be at your expense, right? I think that's what the party always assumes, right? There's a very interesting study done in the late 1960s by a political scientist named Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, and he looked at these first set of coalition governments, and he interviewed politicians across the parties, from the Hindu right to the communist left, And there's something really fascinating which came out in his interviews, which basically what, I haven't done it systematically like he has, but it's the same result I get from my own research. The only politicians who think that power requires an absolute majority in a government were the CPI, were the communist politicians, right? This old Leninist idea that majorities have to be permanent revolutionary majorities. And that has really caught the party in a bind, right? Because if you're going to contest for power in a parliamentary, in a representative democracy, where there are lots of interests and lots of parties, and you have to think of a different strategy, or you do what, in a sense, the Naxalites in that sense are kind of more honest. Although I think they're sort of in long-term, they have their own problems, right, with the violence taking a role for its own sake as well, where they say, look, we're not going to contest elections. We're going to fight the state. The state is a very menacing, repressive state. We're going to take up arms against it. There's huge debates on that, whether that's the appropriate strategy or not, about what kind of coercion is being used in that situation as well. But at least I think in the case of the Maoists in India, it's very clear that they say we're not going to go down that parliamentary route because it leads to those kind of compromises and co-optation. But then they have another problem, which is, okay, so is it ethically or politically entirely defensible what you're doing? Right? And that's a very polarized debate. So I just think that what I was trying to get at is that given that you're a parliamentary party, given that you're competing for votes, given that you're in a period where so many new voices and interests and groups are participating in this democracy, is the strategy that you have, right, the right one to contest in this kind of political space? And so what I've been trying to suggest is it's not. Even if, in a sense, if they join those governments, they will get de-radicalized. But the point is, they've been de-radicalized for a long time anyway, right? So then it's begging the question: what are you doing as a communist party, fighting democratic elections? So I think, in a sense, that's the contradiction I've been trying to get at. And good political judgment, you're right. I mean, that's a whole other issue. I guess my short answer would simply be. What I meant by good political judgment, I wasn't good. Whenever I use the word good, it gets me into trouble, right? Because there's a normative dimension to it, and I don't mean pure crass instrumentalism, right? So Modi, you might say, has good political judgment because he keeps staying in power and he does horrific things in his state. I'm not endorsing that at all. I guess I do take a more pluralist view on good political judgment, which means to say, good political judgment is often used by writers or theorists to say, we assume that actors have certain causes or passions. It's a very Weberian definition, right? They have certain passions or causes they believe in. If they don't, then they're just amoral or they're just purely instrumental. We're not worried about them. We're worried about the fact that in this room, we have different causes and passions. And judgment is, how can we best realize and secure those causes, right? How can we realize our aims best? I mean it simply in that sense. So it's about a means-end relationship. And I use it in this context to say, given that the ends of the communists were this, how did they end up here? And my sense is that they exercise poor political judgment given their aims and given the context that they're fighting in and given the strategies they employ to achieve those aims. So that's in a sense what I was trying to do.
Thank you very much.